And now begin, I say, the core of the conference, the plenary, sorry. And we have two speeches by two international speakers, and we start with the first one. I invite Professor Alessandro Cavalli and Professor Sobhi Tawil. Professor Alessandro Cavalli from the University of Padua, and President of the Association for Scuola Democratica, who will introduce the first speaker, Sobhi Tawil from UNESCO.
Well, I'm happy and honored to be able to introduce to you Sobhi Tawil, because when we decided or thought about organizing this conference on social justice, education, and for social justice, we thought that the main focus should be, of course, on the relationship between education and social inequality in our societies. But what is our society now? Is the Sardinian society, or the Italian society, or the European society, or the global north or the global south? What is our society? That is the problem that we approached. And then we thought, who could we invite to talk about the global dimension of social justice and relationship to education? And then we had the chance that Sobhi Tawil was able to come to Cagliari, and he is probably one of the best persons who is able to talk about this problem in this direction, this way of thinking. He is the director of the Future and Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO. And UNESCO is probably the largest international organization we can think about concerning this type of problem. It is not the only reason why he has done a lot of things. I will not tell you everything he has done in his life, because I would take too much time to and I spare words. And I only say that, well, he has got a PhD. Who does not want it? Does not get a PhD now. He has got a PhD in Geneva. But I want to mention only one thing, that he worked in one of his many endeavors for the International Committee of the Red Cross. This is important because the Red Cross is probably the first international organization that was founded almost 2 centuries ago in relationship to a war that was fought in our country. So that's, I think, a minor aspect of his importance, but I wanted to mention it in the introduction. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Just on the International Committee of the Red Cross, it was an education project that I was in charge of, exploring humanitarian law. This is about 20 years ago. People didn't understand why it was relevant. Unfortunately, today and in the past 8-9 months, everyone has heard of international humanitarian law. That's another road I won't go down. But thank you for this opportunity, really, to just share some thoughts. And congratulations, I must say, it's almost intimidating. You have a full house. And congratulations on this third edition of your conference. Let me perhaps start by making clear two premises that I'm adopting for this presentation discussion. Some of it might appear obvious to you, but it's also from my position in an international organization. The first is that, and the title, Renewing the Social Contract for Education for Just and Sustainable Futures. That sustainable futures, the first premise is that sustainable futures must be grounded in social justice. And some would argue that sustainability must be informed by social, economic, environmental, and epistemic justice. And we just heard Professor Marco Gonzalez mention this. And the applications of the principle of justice to the economy, to the environment, or to the knowledge commons, all have a social dimension. So I would very much agree with what was said just before. Sustainable futures must be grounded in social justice. The second premise is that a social justice approach necessarily engages with the political dimension of education. Now this might seem very obvious after what we heard to you. But again, I say this because I'm coming to this from the perspective of the headquarters of an intergovernmental organization that works around the world with countries with all kinds of political systems and regimes. So the first thing I wanted to say is that from where I work and sit, and in one of the organizations that is within the core, let's say, of the global education and development landscape, UNESCO works in education and culture and science, as you know. But I note that there is a lot in the current global education policy discourse, which is couched in terms of transformation and of the future. Many of you will be aware that later this year in September, at the United Nations in New York, is the Summit of the Future. We'll be adopting a pact for the future. It's defined as a gathering of global leaders shaping tomorrow. And the pact for the future is meant to redefine paths towards a brighter present and a more secure tomorrow. So all this talk about future and transformation. In 2022, just 2 years ago, a little under 2 years ago, the UN also organized the Transforming Education Summit, partly to, and I quote, to sow the seeds to transform education in a rapidly changing world. Even at UNESCO, we put out in 2021, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education. Myself, I'm partly guilty, I'm in charge of a team called the Future of Learning and Innovation. But the language, and one could argue that the COVID-19 disruption further accentuated this tendency and further catalyzed discussions when it initially raised awareness both about our collective vulnerability and fragility, as well as of our interdependence. And there was, at least initially, some thinking or rethinking about our development models, our economic development models, and more generally of the way in which our societies are organized. But the language of transformation in education goes back a little further than that. Even the 2030 agenda for sustainable development is actually entitled Transforming Our World. So that's the first observation, but connected to that is the fact that there seems to be a discrepancy between this talk about transformation and the proposed actions that we see, at least at the international level. And what is being proposed as part of this dynamic on transforming education, in my view, does not seem to be very different from anything we've seen before. And before, we didn't call it transform. We would call it reform, we would call it efforts to improve. And so the proposed actions as part of this transforming education seem locked in the logic of incremental change, incremental improvement, rather than what transformation seems to suggest, which is a more substantive change. The International Committee on the Futures of Education did attempt a simple definition of transforming education. That it means going beyond reform. That rather than better versions of our existing education systems, we need systems which are different from those we have today. So it does imply some fundamental change. And transforming education also encompasses teaching and learning that is transformative for learners. So transformative education empowers as it connects people to each other and to the world, exposes learners to new possibilities, and strengthens their capacity for critique, dialogue, knowledge creation, and action. If we look at the time in 2022 at the time of this summit around transforming education, countries were encouraged to undertake national consultations on transforming education and to make commitments to transform education. And we have some 130 countries that submitted at the UN level national statements of commitment to transform education. We've looked at those. We've looked at them carefully, at least a small group of us. When I say we, it's not the organization, but within our team. And largely, these commitments are largely about doing more of the same. Doing business as usual, perhaps doing more, but doing the same. So it's a reinforcement of the status quo. And there's much less in these statements about more substantive change, moving us to education systems that are different from today. And there's much less about metamorphosis, because that's what transform is about, and much more about continuation of what is. So, just two examples on that. One, from these statements of commitment. There were 130 countries submitting these statements of commitment. The first has to do with curriculum, pedagogy, and the teaching profession. So unsurprisingly, if we look at 130 country commitments to transform education, it comes as no surprise that 3/4 of them, some 75%, cite curriculum reform and the renewal of content and methods as important levers for the transformation of education. Half signal learning content that needs to be centered around the environment, around green transitions, about more interdisciplinary approaches and understandings of the environment. In terms of learning methods, it comes as no surprise that we speak of renewed pedagogy, developing the ability of learners to navigate future uncertainties, approach complex problems, and multi-dimensional challenges. 40% of the countries said that rote learning based on memorization, remains a major obstacle and must be addressed. And it also comes as no surprise that transformation of curricular content and curricular methods is not possible without teachers. That 95% of these country commitments highlighted the need to strengthen pre-service and in-service and professional development of teachers. Up until here, it all sounds fine. But then very paradoxically, only 1/3 of the countries acknowledge the need to improve the working conditions and the social status of teachers that we know has declined in so many countries around the world. Only 1/4 of the countries address the fundamental issue of teacher shortage. At the global level, we estimate we're in need of some 70 million teachers if we are to meet the goal set for 2030. And we know that a significant number of teachers are working as contract teachers. And this is the case not only in the global south, but also in parts of the global north. In sub-Saharan Africa, 65% of teachers have are contract teachers. So only a handful of these 130 countries that are speaking about transforming pedagogy and curriculum actually address the structural issues that may explain the shortage of teachers, their declining working conditions and status, or the precarious conditions of contract teachers. So how can we transform education without a serious effort to recruit, to train, to retain qualified teachers? And to what extent can we hope to transform teaching and learning practices without actually addressing the fundamental social, economic, and political issues that define the teaching profession? So that's the first example. The second has to do with inclusive education. Over 85% of these national statements, commitments to transform education, underscored the importance of ensuring more inclusive education systems. 3/4 acknowledge socioeconomic vulnerability as a key barrier to educational access and participation. And while they reference different measures to offset the direct and indirect costs of education for more vulnerable communities, school feeding programs, tuition-free exemptions, scholarship programs, there were no concrete proposals on how to reduce the incidence of poverty. 2/3 of these same countries recognize the challenges related to gender equality, but none of them actually reference strategies and measures that go to the root of the discrimination on the basis of gender. And finally, and if we look at one key figure in my eyes, fewer than 15 of the statements, these are at the global level, addressed educational inclusion from the perspective of cultural or linguistic minorities. None of the countries, more than 130 countries, none brought up the question of language of instruction. And the question of, obviously, mother tongue instruction as a cultural right and a means of strengthening the foundational learning. And this, paradoxically, in a world where our colleagues from the Global Education Monitoring Report estimate that 40% of students in the world are being taught in a language that they don't speak. 40%. So if we're talking about transforming education, and we seem to be avoiding the underlying structural issues. Transforming curriculum and pedagogy requires qualified teachers. They need to be well supported. The issues of teacher shortage need to be addressed. The decline in the share of qualified teachers in both primary and secondary in sub-Saharan Africa and in some parts of the Middle East. The working conditions, the over-reliance on contract teachers, all require political responses. And to be fair, political responses which are beyond the remit of educational authorities. And it might be the case that these national commitments to transform education were formulated essentially from the perspective of national ministries of education. It would have looked a little different to have a true intersectoral consultation on the future of education and what are some of the underlying barriers to inclusion, to equity, and to the realization of the right to education. So transforming education to make systems more equitable and inclusive requires addressing the root causes of exclusion and not merely attempts to reduce the effects of such symptoms. A social justice approach, and I think that is what is interesting, and I will mention a quick anecdote that I mentioned earlier that happened this morning. A social justice approach in education would encourage the pursuit of these more transformative changes within and beyond the education system, acknowledging that there are structural issues that require political responses. Earlier this morning, I was on a webinar with my boss and some colleagues. We were speaking about the Global Education Meeting later this year. It happens every 3-4 years. It's a mechanism of taking stock of progress towards Sustainable Development Goal 4. And then one of my colleagues very rightly pointed out, it's called Global Education Meeting 2024. I mean, it's we should give it some kind of framing. And he suggested social justice. But others quickly replied, we can't do that. We cannot do that at the level that we're at. In UNESCO, in a United Nations organization, because a social justice approach recognizes, acknowledges, and engages with the political dimensions of education, something that we can't quite do. And that's why I would say this discrepancy between what is all this language about transform, everything is transformed now in education, and higher education, and transform learning, and transform, and yet there is very little in what we see, at least at that level, that actually translates or reflects any kind of transformative action in education. And I think there are there might be more, but there's at least two reasons. I think one reason, or one way of explaining this discrepancy, is that we are afflicted in international education and development by short-termism. We are in short-term mindsets. And actually, if we look at the three objectives of the Transforming Education Summit, the first was about addressing the effects of the COVID pandemic in terms of learning loss, in terms of the psychosocial and socio-emotional impact on students during school closure. It's important, but it's a crisis that needs a crisis response. It's a short term. There is no room for saying we will do things differently. We have to address a crisis. The second objective of the Transforming Education Summit was, and to paraphrase, to get Sustainable Development Goal number 4 back on track. Not sure what that means, especially because some of the goals have got to do with human rights and respect for cultural diversity and awareness and sensitivity to environmental issues. How do we know when we're on track or not on track? So what happens is that a longer-term thinking, longer-term looking at long-term trends that explain where we are today, or looking at a longer-term ambition in terms of the future, it seems to be a luxury when we're in that mode. So I think the first explanation of this discrepancy between this language of transform, but actually nothing much is changing, is this short-term mindset that we're largely stuck in. But the second, and I've already alluded to that, is the failure of international education and development policy to recognize the inherently political nature of education. The failure to do so, or perhaps the impossibility, to be fairer to myself and the organization I work with, or the difficulty of actually engaging with that at that level, at the international level, given the diversity of context, the diversity of political systems that we have. And that's why much of the international education development discourse remains technical and kind of obscures the political. When we talk about global citizenship education, which in my view, and some UK academics have called these terms, global citizenship education and others like it, they have called them buzzwords. Fuzzwords. They are not only buzzwords because they're fashionable, but they are actually not concepts. You cannot operationalize them. But everyone is happy with it. Yes, global citizenship education. But it obscures the fact that citizenship is both a feeling of affiliation, but it also has a legal dimension. It's also a set of roles, obligations, responsibilities, and rights, and it does not exist at the global level. So when we're saying global citizenship education, we're actually talking about the sense, the affiliation to our common humanity, to a global community, which is fine. But let's call things what, by their names. And these fuzzwords, as these two UK scholars have actually prevent us from actually advancing. I mean, how does one translate this into curriculum development, into assessments, into teacher training, etc.? So, this failure or difficulty or challenge or impossibility to recognize the inherently political nature of education. Citizenship education, we can call it whatever we want. I would call it, in whatever context and whatever political regime. It is about social, civic, and political education. It is about fashioning our identities, our perceptions, and our attitudes to others, to the world. So it is, if we need to call things, bringing in the term political, when I even say this in my milieu, people are uneasy. They don't hear that. You don't hear the term political. And this is really what is a social justice approach in education, and that's why I think so interesting in your framing of the conference. It is it is about attempting to rectify past exclusions, inequalities, maybe oppressions, while also aspiring and shaping a more just and sustainable future. And this, I think, is what is meant by the call of the International Commission on the Futures of Education in the call to renew the social contract for education. It implies a renewal of the social contract, implies both political measures to transform education systems, and this by overcoming some of the structural barriers, some of the root causes that explain exclusion, and at the same time, more progressive approaches to transformative education, to transformative teaching and learning, which acknowledges the political dimension of citizenship education. In the report of the International Commission on the Futures of Education and this call for renewing the social contract for education, the report starts from the point of view that the future of humanity and the planet are at risk, and that we face an existential choice: continue on an unsustainable path, environmentally unsustainable, but also socially unsustainable, economically unsustainable, or the choices between continuing on that unsustainable path or radically changing course. And the risks are many. The widening inequalities. It's actually quite discouraging to think that when the 2030 agenda was in preparation, it was adopted in 2015. So in 2013-14 were consultations globally on this new agenda. And the first theme that was addressed was inequalities. And things have only gotten worse. Inequalities within countries have grown. There is even greater concentration of wealth today than there has ever been. So, widening inequalities, greater concentration of wealth, the destruction of our actions on the natural environment, the impact of climate change, the democratic backsliding we have seen. Freedom House, which monitors civic and political freedoms, has documented that in the last 15 years, every year, the number of countries where civil and political rights are declining outnumber the number of countries where there has been progress in terms of political freedoms. And then we can add to the mix technology, artificial intelligence, the pace at which is making it very difficult for us to regulate and to govern, and raising some fundamental questions about what it means really to be human. And when we mention the purpose of education, what is really the unique characteristics of the human person and faculties that we should be developing? It could have to do with an ethical framing, things that technology have been unable to do, at least up until now. So the framing in the futures of education is to say education is key to changing course, to taking us in a different direction, in a more sustainable direction. But it can't be the same education. It can't be the same education that has led us to where we are. It can't be the same model where we still have 250 million children who are out of school. It can't be the same model, otherwise how do we explain that we have over 750 million youth and adults today in 2024 that cannot read or write in any language? We're in the 21st century. A model where, and this is the international average, the second cycle of secondary school, upper secondary. The global average is that 1 in 2 students in school do not complete the cycle. Why do we pursue this one? What is going on? Why are we not asking these more fundamental questions? And this is what transformation would be about. It would be about addressing some of these root questions. So, social justice, I don't want to take social justice in education. Why is it important? One, because education is a basic human right, but education is also an enabling right. And so if we deny education, then we're also denying a range of other rights, the right to information, the right to participation, and others. And second, education can have a positive development impact. The positive impact of education on health, on productivity, on social capital for individuals and families is well documented. Education can also have a positive impact on contributing to social cohesion. But the potential of education to strengthen social cohesion is dependent on the equitable distribution of educational opportunities. So education can allow for more inclusive, fairer, and more just societies, and this is key to social cohesion. But the inequitable distribution of access to educational opportunities, on the other hand, can obviously exacerbate these disparities. These structural issues beyond education, we speak of disabilities in education. Today there are 1.3 billion people, it's 16% of the world population. 1.3 billion people living with disabilities of some kind. 1.3 billion. And they are at higher risk of being excluded from healthcare, from education, from work, and from other aspects of community life. We still have today 720 million people in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is living with $2 US dollars and 15 cents a day. It's almost 10% of the world population. Extreme poverty. Excluded from a range of social rights, including education. 160 million children engaged in child labor, and again deprived from a range of children's rights, the right to protection, to health, to education. There's also cultural exclusion, and we have mentioned the 40% of students who are being taught in a language that is not their own, that they don't initially understand or speak. There's political exclusion and exclusion from citizenship. 4.4 million stateless people denied citizenship and civic and political rights. And today we can add another layer, which is digital exclusion, with the progressive but certain digitalization of our societies, that this becomes an absolute necessity. And that digital exclusion may result from lack of access to the internet or to devices, or a question of affordability, or the lack of skills to use it properly, or even social norms that might, in some cases, determine and define, in particular, young girls' access in more traditional societies, their access to, for example, mobile devices. So, I could go on, but just to say that although there has been progress historically over the decades in terms of access to educational opportunity, it's not, our models and our approaches are not working well for everyone. We still have persistent exclusion. And this is reason enough to be rethinking our educational models. Usually when we hear about the futures of education, we say the world is changing. Technology, and that's changing the labor market. We need to adapt. That's the conventional, that's the dominant discourse on the futures of education. But even if that were not all happening, and the climate crisis, and whatever, even if that were not happening, this persistent exclusion is reason enough for us to be rethinking our models and approaches. But it's also true that education is part of the problem. Some of our models, how we teach, what we teach, whether in terms of educated people and educated societies being those that contribute the most to climate change. So what are we promoting if it's not, models based on competition, on individualism, on consumption, on individual accomplishment, on divisiveness, on human exceptionalism, that we master and dominate the natural world, and unsustainable lifestyles. So education can also be part of the problem. And for both of these reasons, we need to rethink and redefine the social contract for education. So changing course, and I'll end here. Changing course requires, and I think this is where the social justice approach to education is attempting to do that. Changing course is combining political changes at the system level, top-down efforts of government, whole-of-government approaches. But changing course is also bottom-up, and we heard that transformative, civic, political, social engagements supported by critical citizenship education that can promote fundamental change, that can mobilize not only in how we think and view the world, but also on how we act individually and collectively. And so, given the urgency of the intersecting challenges that we're confronted with at the global level, the political nature of educational transformation, both at the system level, to rectify past exclusion, and at the level of transformative teaching and learning, is absolutely necessary. And it's only a social justice approach to education, policy and practice, that can guide us in this direction. And why this might not always be possible top-down for a variety of reasons, because of the nature of political systems, in particular context, it is definitely possible at the grassroots level and in a bottom-up fashion. And I think this is what many of you as researchers and teachers are doing in framing your work and inspiring your work in the prism of a social justice approach to education. And I'll stop here, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important words. And we now move on the second keynote lecture. I give the floor to my colleague Antonietta De Feo, who will introduce Professor Agnes van Santen.